I'm going to take you through the game between Arkady Naiditsch and Vincent Keymer from round 4 of the Grenke Chess Classic. Remember, if you're not subscribed to the channel, then do click on the button below. It's that simple. And if you'd like to support the channel, help us keep the lights on, then do check out the links to PayPal and Patreon.com in the video description. Right, on with this game. Well, we're about to see an absolutely blistering attack. This was great fun. So we've got Naiditsch with white. He's an interesting guy. Born in Soviet Russia, in Latvia. Emigrated to Germany, represented Germany for 10 years. But in 2015, he switched federations again and now lives in Baku in Azerbaijan and represents Azerbaijan. He's, I think, a fascinating player because he's incredibly confident. He's really optimistic in the way he plays, always trying to find a way to win. And that means that sometimes he gets fantastic results. He has a very good record in open tournaments, for example. He was equal first in the Isle of Man tournament in the autumn. But sometimes that means he crashes and burns because he's too optimistic. But his games are always interesting to watch. So he's playing Vincent Keymer, who so far in the tournament, well, hasn't scored at all, 0 out of 3 up to this point. But he was winning against Caruana, against Magnus. Well, he probably should have drawn that game. So, well, we can see he's good enough. But has he got the ability to actually last out and get some points? Let's find out. Okay, so Naiditsch against Keymer. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through this game without too much deviation from the actual game because I want you to see the whole flow of this. So, knight c3. Now that's an interesting move from Naiditsch. I mean, he has a very broad repertoire actually. But he knows that Keymer principally plays the Naidorf variation. So this is an interesting little move order finesse actually. So for example, if Keymer were to play d6, then there are various things you can do there. You can play f4 and perhaps play some kind of Grand Prix attack. Keymer plays a6. So that means that if Naiditsch were to go back into an open Sicilian with d4, then it would still become a Naidorf variation. For example, after this and knight takes, then we have a Naidorf again. But Naiditsch decided to play a4. So just clamping down on b5. So knight f6. And once again, white can go into an open Sicilian with d4. But Naiditsch decides to play a closed variation, which looks a bit tame. But there is a bit more to this than meets the eye. And here Keymer goes for e6. I think the most logical move here is to play g6, but perhaps he wasn't too comfortable with going into that kind of open Sicilian. But e6 played. Perfectly respectable move. And again, he's probably anticipating that white could still go into an open Sicilian with d4, and then he's got a normal kind of Scheveninger position. So that's the kind of Sicilian he's comfortable with. But Naiditsch keeps it closed, could still play d4, but he plays f4. So this takes the game into a very different direction. It's a closed centre, or, well, not exactly closed, but the two sides haven't engaged with each other at this point. So let me continue with the game, and I'm going to come back and look at various points where players could have deviated. So h3, white starts the traditional build-up on the kingside, and the knight drops in anticipation of g4 and g5 happening. And now Keymer plays h6. to prevent the pawn coming to g5, gaining more ground. Knight g3. So Naiditsch, absolutely typical for him. He's decided, right, I'm sending my pieces to the kingside. It's pretty clear what's happening. Bishop h4, an interesting move. Putting a bit of pressure on the knight. And the queen's knight drops back to support its colleague here. And this knight probably wants to drop back anyway and swing around towards the kingside. b5, so interesting moment. Should white exchange on b5? Well, actually, Naiditsch decides not to, and I think this is a good choice. Because if white had exchanged, let me just go back a moment, if white exchanges here, then in fact black could use this to his advantage by playing the bishop out and then the rook here and actually get some counterplay on the a file. So just leaving that pawn on a4 is clever because, well, Keymer passes, but you can, which it's useful to have the pawn on b4 because it gives you greater control over d4, but it means the position is closed on the queen side. From white's point of view, that's what Naiditsch wants, because he wants the action to take place on the king side. He doesn't want to be distracted in the middle or on the queen side. If that side of the board remains closed, it means he can devote his energy to attacking on the king side. But so far, no clear way through for white on the king side. Bishop a6, threatening to perhaps break open with c4. So b3 keeps everything closed. So, I mean, I think at this point, Naiditsch wouldn't have been too unhappy with the turn of events. Queen e7. And Naiditsch just shuffling over, rook g1. Opposite black's king. And that leaves room for rook number 2 to come over. So what a concentration of forces on the king side from Naiditsch. Very interesting. g6. What do you think of that move? Well, I've got to say, if I were black, I wouldn't be playing like that. I mean, as I said, I'm going to go back later and point out various moments where I think Keymer could have improved. But g6 I really don't like because it leaves this one vulnerable. It's interesting, if you feed this into your computer, it will tell you that black is doing absolutely fine. Black is slightly better. But I would say in practical terms, this is already very difficult for black. e5. Yeah, it's time, definitely time to break. By the way, if f5 here, well, let me see. It's possible to close with g5. It's also possible to play bishop g5, actually, to exchange those bishops off. And you can see that black's knight would come in, or one of those knights would come into e5. So this is the point of e5. It actually takes away that square. So for example, after pawn takes pawn, then you play f5. And this is a very different situation because white's knight, or perhaps a bishop, is able to occupy e4, and that really will lend strength to white's kingside attack. Absolutely typical idea in this kind of close Sicilian position. And you can see that black's knights can't occupy the e5 square, which would help with the defense of the king side. So it's a really important attacking idea. So after e5, Keymer closed the position with d5, and you can see that takes away this square from white pieces. Nevertheless, the position is closed in the middle of the board, and black still hasn't engaged on the queen side and in the middle, so that gives white time to attack. And Naiditsch, well, he's absolutely not afraid to move forward. And it makes perfect sense with the concentration of white's pieces on the king side. And here, well, obviously this gives up a pawn. This allows black to take the pawn on e5, but you know, it seems very logical to do this. I think at this moment black could have played g5 to prevent bishop takes pawn. And again, if you feed this into your computer, it will say that black is actually fine here. Maybe it's, I don't know, just counting material. Depends which computer you feed it in. If you fed this to AlphaZero, I suspect AlphaZero would be rubbing its hands, its silicon hands or whatever it is, with glee at this position for white, because in this kind of situation there is every chance that white will be able to just close the gates on the king side and break through with h4 or some move like this at some moment, maybe doubling here. Of course, I understand there are various pawns and things that can be captured, but this is extremely dangerous for black. Look at the protection around black's king. It really isn't there at the moment. And as I said, the concentration of forces on the king side for white, it is so dangerous. You know, I would take white every time in that position. Nevertheless, g5 was certainly the best move to block out white's pieces. Instead, Keymer took on e5. And now bishop takes pawn, and this is getting quite serious. Because that bishop on h6 is obviously doing a superb job of controlling the f8 square. It's yeah, a very useful helper. And now g5 is an excellent move. So shutting off the bishop, and now this queen is about to come here. So basically, you know, this bishop is going to be exchanged off, and then, you know, white has very good control over these dark squares. At the moment, white isn't even material down to get to this position. So this is great fun for white to play. And I think things are definitely turning in white's favour now. Queen f4, good move. Now there are various captures that black has here. Let's take a little look. Bishop takes. This basically loses material, because after this, then you take the bishop on g5, and two minor pieces for a rook, better for white. Let's go back. There's knight takes. Well, this loses in spectacular style to knight h5. And after this is taken, then you take here, and obviously there is huge trouble in this position for black. It's possible for black simply to give up bishop for knight here. But this is tremendous for white. You know, this bishop does such a good job of controlling the f8 square, so, you know, black is vulnerable on the f file. There's knight f4 coming. If the knight takes the bishop, then that opens up the g file. So it's tremendous. Now in the game, knight takes bishop happened. Queen takes. Now this knight would very much like to come to f5, but this loses, well, fairly spectacularly to this. But it's just straight on. Basically, white just has to blast his way through here. And, well, you can give up the queen, of course, that's hopeless. But let's just have a look at a checkmate. There are some nice checkmates here. And queen h6. I love this kind of crossfire. Very nice. We saw that mating pattern in my last hangout, actually. In a little study I showed. Okay, so this is the position. And knight f7 played. And here is where Naiditsch plays really spectacularly. He could simply play knight f4 here, and, well, let's have a quick look. After this, queen takes, a simple exchange of queens, but that leaves white in a fantastic position because, Well, you look at these pieces and look at black's king. Black is not going to survive that. White is no material down there. But instead, Naiditsch played in a really spectacular way. Again, this kind of shows his confidence that he has a safe way to play, but in fact he goes for something really spectacular and outrageous. Gives up one piece and now plonks the rook on f6 where it can be taken. This is great stuff. So the point of this is simply to shut out black's pieces, and then this knight is going to follow up. For example, if c4, let's try and generate something, but actually we can ignore this. The knight is coming in. You know, we're going to play knight g6 and play and take here. I mean, it's a disastrous position for black. Or queen takes and g6. For example, here, and queen takes h5. Threatening to push the pawn again and take on f7. I mean, it's completely winning for white, basically. So rook f6 has just been played. Knight takes. Pawn takes. So white is a rook down now, but the king is in trouble. Queen check is necessary, otherwise queen g3 and queen g7 would be mates. Knight goes in the way. And queen g3, threatening mate. So the rook shuffles across. And now before checking here, rook e1. So ready to play queen g7 and then rook e6, for example. And this is hopelessly lost. Let's just go to the end of the game. e5. And the position breaks open. The king is not escaping from white's attack here. Well, if knight takes knight, then that would simply win the queen. And then that pawn would be decisive. You can see this bishop never gets in the game. It's just blocks out here. So knight takes e5, just played. Queen takes f6. Knight g4, discovered check. Queen comes back and knight f6. That was the final move of the game. King f8, queen g8 would be mate, for example. Oh, yeah, that will do nicely. Well, what a rout. And I mean, I really like the way Naiditsch played. Absolutely full on the king side. But let's go back, because obviously, you know, to lose a game such as that is very painful. I feel very sorry for Vincent Keymer, only 14 years old, and so far 0 out of 4 in the tournament. Very tough for him. But this game, I think it's probably his worst performance, actually. All right, so how do we avoid this, basically? I've played this kind of position a great deal, both with white and black, actually. And one thing, you know, when I'm playing this kind of position with white, is that I love it when my opponent starts to move these pawns. h6 is not a bad move, in fact. I think it's reasonable to play h6 to forestall g5. But once g6 happened, then this is an invitation to dinner, basically. Very difficult. But let's go back. I mean, it seemed to me that Keymer never really found a clear plan. He was moving his pieces around, but not with any clear strategy. So, going back to this position, right at the start, d5. Let's engage in the middle of the board. And if e5, then the knight comes back to d7, and black will play f6 very quickly and break up white's centre. I think that's a reasonable way to play. Okay, let's go a little bit further on. Not everyone likes that kind of French structure. That's fine, we can play in different ways. So in this position, off g4, yes. h6, I mean, as I said, I don't think there's any need to touch that pawn, actually. Another way to play this position is to play b5. Now, you want to play b4 to attack this knight. So the knight moves out of the way. And then, before playing b4, put the knight on d4. This is where this knight belongs. And this is immediately, white has to engage with black. So if this knight drops back to e2, well, it's possible to leave this knight here, actually. But a simple exchange actually takes away some of the pressure in the position and actually relieves the congestion in black's camp. So that, you know, bishop b7 and then maybe d5 and possibly d4 later might exchange some pieces, or we might be able to play c4 at some moment. But I think that exchange of pieces just takes some pressure off black, actually. And as I said, in this kind of position, actually, it's not even necessary to exchange, because it might be nice for white to exchange, and then this opens up the c-file, for example. You could play knight d4 straight away with a similar kind of thing. So after this exchange, you play e5, and you can see it's absolutely not necessary to have h6 in this position, because black is engaging white in the middle and on the king side. So if f5, you can see that these squares are controlled, so it's not easy for white to push forward, and then black will have counterplay on the c-file. In the game, in this position, even after h6, now here is where Keymer played bishop h4. Well, it's an interesting move, but why not play knight d4? I far prefer that move. Plonk the knight on the outpost. So, there's a few little ideas. As I said, if you feed these moves into a computer, then actually it is still quite optimistic about black's position, even when we get here. But in practical terms, I think basically this is a difficult position for black, because black has not engaged in the middle or on the queen side, and the play is concentrated on the king side, and that's where white's pieces are. Danger, danger, danger. There's a lot of paint on the board. So there you go. I hope Vincent manages to recover, but great victory for Arkady Naiditsch. Now, I should have to say the Caruana-Carlsen game in round 4 was very, very interesting, but that ended up a draw. So, but Vichy won, so now 2 leaders after 4 rounds at the Grenke Chess Classic. Carlsen and Anand both with 3 points.